I'm an immigration lawyer who does the affirmative side and loves to sue the government. We have really outdated laws. They're making decisions that are incorrect and they're hurting U.S. You might be waiting 30 years or more in line before you actually get that green card. My case was denied without them even looking at this evidence, beholden to those for 30 years or maybe more, while you're in this backlog just watching the dates very, very slowly creep up towards when your application can be decided. We've been hearing about these mass deportations that are planned. We're going to see 1 million deportations.
Welcome to the New World Podcast, where we delve into the ever-changing and accelerating pace of global change and its impact on our lives. I'm your host, John Paul Flores, broadcasting live from the New World Studio. Today, we're diving into the world of AI and automation. As an enthusiast and expert in lead generation, I will guide you through understanding and leveraging these technologies for your business and for your personal use. And don't forget, AI and automation might be unstoppable forces, but that doesn't mean you are powerless. Tune in to learn how to make them work for you and not the other way around. But first, let's meet our guest. Welcome to the New World Podcast, where we navigate the changing world around us. I'm your host, John Paul Flores, specializing in lead generation and AI automation, here to help you understand how our world is changing and what it means for you. In this episode, we're joined by Zachary, a top immigration attorney at Joseph H. Hall, BC. We discuss potential shifts under Trump's return, the best legal pathways for immigrants, when to sue the U.S. government, and how immigration shapes industries and the economy. I know the topics are controversial and it's very fun to talk about. That's why I'm choosing them. Zachary, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me on. Yeah, immigration is a kind of inherently political topic, but hopefully we can get some good facts out there and reach some kind of common understandings with everybody.
By the way, before we begin the in-depth questions, because I do have some, do you mind giving us a quick intro on who Zachary is? What's your expertise, experiences, and what keeps you busy these days?
Absolutely. So my name's Zachary New. I'm a partner here at Joseph and Hall. It's an immigration firm in Denver, Colorado. My specialty is in the business or employment side of immigration. So rather than helping folks who are in deportation or removal proceedings, I assist people in getting visas to come and work in the United States, potentially investors who are trying to invest into a business and start working in the United States, or companies who are transferring workers from one company in, let's say, the United Kingdom to the United States, things along those lines. So rather than the defensive side of immigration, I'm much more focused on the affirmative side of immigration, which also leads me to kind of my second specialty, I suppose, and my real passion in immigration law, which is suing the U.S. government. We see a lot of poor decisions out of the U.S. government's immigration agency, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service. Because of that, oftentimes we have to take them in front of an actual federal judge and say, hey, this agency is doing a very poor job. They're making decisions that are incorrect, and they're hurting U.S. companies, they're hurting individuals. And hey, judge, we need to fix that. So that's my brief background, I suppose, on who I am. Immigration lawyer who does the affirmative side and loves to sue the government.
There's a lot of people who does interesting things, but not on the extent of that you're suing your own government. So it's a pretty tough job.
It's I think an intimidating thing to start off with, but I think the people who are really the brave ones, the ones who are stepping up and suing the government on their own behalf. I'm the attorney here who I'm filing the lawsuit. I'm the attorney of record who's going in front of the judge, but I'm not the one who has the name. Zachary New, the United States, who's been harmed. That's a really great thing to do, and so I really commend those individuals and those companies for stepping up, not only to protect their own interests, but also to protect the interests of their employees, and to protect really a lot of everybody's interests. So we're a government of checks and balances. We have the three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. But you can't really have the judicial branch checking the legislative branch and checking the executive branch if you don't have individuals who are brave enough to step up and say something's being done that's wrong, something is being done illegally, and I need to fight my government on this, litigate about what this issue is, whether it's a policy that's been improperly created or a decision that's been just done poorly. So those are the folks that I think are the really the bravest people that I work with.
That's amazing. And if you think about it, if we want a government that is completely pro on freedom, we want the kind of people who actually will fight for what is right, even if the enemy is the government.
Exactly. I mean, the government can only go as far as you let it go. The law says that the government can't create a law out of thin air. Well, if you're not willing to say you created this law out of thin air and go to a judge and say, look at all these illegal practices that are happening, those things just kind of are allowed to continue, and that line is pushed, and so it becomes harder and harder to fight back against these kind of overreaches that we see. So, immigration law, like I said, it's an inherently political thing. People have very, very strong opinions on it, but I think that there's a middle ground for both sides of the political spectrum. If you're very left leaning, you can see the kind of I guess humanitarian aspect of this. You can see we need to have additional protections for individuals, additional protections for people and for businesses. On the other side of things, on the right side of the spectrum, you can kind of see this government overreach argument. You can see this kind of libertarian bent to it, where you're saying, hey, rather than focusing so much on the kind of progressive side of agendas or whatever it might be, we need to keep our government in check. We need to keep the government from all this overreach, spending money in a way that's totally improper, or wasting people's time, wasting businesses' time, and hurting businesses, because this is only going to hurt us in the bottom line. So in the end, both sides of the political spectrum, I think, can come to an agreement that we want our immigration agency to do things properly, and that's where my job is fun, because we can have that everybody comes together to do the right thing type argument.
Why did you choose immigration law? Because there's so much different choices, and especially because you chose a very amazing field where immigration law and suing the U.S. government as a specialty. Why go on that specialty?
Yeah, I always said that I'm a kind of a product of the mentors that I've had in my life. Originally, when I went to my undergraduate institution, I was going to work in a consulate. That was what I wanted to do. I wanted to work as a foreign service officer. It's a really cool job. You get to be stationed around the world. You go to, you start off in what's called a hardship country. So you kind of cut your teeth in this little bit more, rough area. And then after a few years, then you get stationed in a more stable, kind of more diplomatically friendly area. And then, you get the chance to live abroad and meet really cool people and work for the U.S. government. And that's what I really wanted to do. And then as I was going through law school, and I was working in immigration clinics, and I was working in workshops, and I was working in law firms, and I got to see the private practice side of things. So, that the foreign service officers, they're the individuals who are actually making decisions on visas, for example. So when somebody goes and makes an application for a visitor visa, they're the ones who are going to have that interview with the person and decide, do I grant this application or do I deny this application? Well, on this side of the practice, I'm the one who's making those applications for people. So I got to have that human contact where I see what people's goals are. I got to see the stories that people had and why they wanted to come to the United States, and I got to see the kind of the impact that my work had in a more hands-on way. It's easy to say here is an approval and then off the person goes and you never see him again. But in the work that I do, I have long-standing relationships with clients where I may go out to lunch with somebody years after I've worked with them and see all the amazing things that they've done. So there's that aspect to it. So after I've kind of was exposed to immigration law on the ground a bit more, I got to see how cool it was to meet, first off, the very interesting people from across the world, because our visas aren't limited to visitors and students and workers. We have categories for people of extraordinary ability who have won kind of the top prizes in the world. So Olympic athletes have this kind of special category for them. I've been able to meet some really truly amazing businessmen and truly amazing scientists who have these inventions that I couldn't even begin to explain, and I have to kind of dumb it down enough for not only myself to understand, but for the immigration agency to understand, for them to receive these visas to come work and live in the United States. I think another big part is that immigration law just kind of inherently has this crossover with all these different parts of law. So, if you really like criminal law, there's an aspect of immigration law that's very, very heavy in criminal law. It's called a crimmigration is how we term it. If you really like family law, well, there's a crossover for immigration and family law. If you like corporate and business law, well, there's a very big crossover for that in immigration law as well. If you like, intellectual property, really any type of law that you like, there is this kind of this crux with this pathway with immigration law where you get to practice that and other types of law as well. So there's this intellectual piece to it that's very, very fun. So you're always doing something new, and that's every day at work is kind of this new experience. So it's an interesting thing to do, and you meet amazing people, I guess, is the way to sum it up.
That's amazing. And I don't think a lot of people actually realize what you just said right there. Most people think immigration law is just about how one person can enter the United States legally, or just how you can bring your family into the US if you're an immigrant. And I don't think a lot of them actually realize that it's a crossover, as you said, with a lot of different aspects of law. And as for someone who is a kind of wants to be excited to go to work every day, I think being an immigration lawyer is one of those things that you get excited for every single day, because there's a lot of unique aspects, as you said.
Absolutely. I mean, you get to kind of choose what you want to do in the end. I have my particular focus, what I really like to do, and who I like to work with. Not everybody sues the government. That's not everybody's cup of tea. That is not something that a lot of immigration practitioners enjoy doing. A lot of immigration practitioners say, I'm going to focus on family things because I really like bringing families together, uniting families. Hey, there's this cross-national relationship. I'm going to help these people establish a life together. They really love doing that. Not to say I don't love doing that, but that's just not what gives me that passion, that fire in my belly to come to work every day. So there's a lot of different ways to practice immigration law, and a lot of different facets to it that different people really are attracted to. So I have my thing that I really like to do, and others have their own things that they really like to do.
As President Trump returned to the office, what significant changes do you think would happen in terms of the policy in immigration that we should expect?
Absolutely. So obviously there's a lot of rhetoric that goes around, first off, during the election season, and then now as we have everything being planned out, potentially planned out, and support being drummed up. We have had President Trump in office before, so we kind of have a little bit of an understanding of what his goals and his priorities are. What I think that we will see is a very real strict, vetting process. It'll be much more of a scrutiny, I suppose, on petitions that have been made, applications that have been made that haven't necessarily been made that way before. So if we looked at the statistics from the previous Trump administration, we would get what's called a request for evidence, which is essentially the U.S. government saying, I'm not sure you qualify for this application. We need additional arguments and additional evidence to prove that you do meet the legal requirements. We saw about a 50% rate for those requests for evidence. Under the Biden administration, That's about a maybe 10 to 20% rate. So we have less of this, focus on fraud, finding fraud in the application process, which, hey, you can look at this two ways, good or bad. Yes, we really, really want to focus on finding every single piece of fraud in the immigration system, or this additional burden that it's going to place on employers is going to impact the ability to bring over hires that are legitimate. It's just going to start to become cost prohibitive for employers to use the immigration system. I also do think that we're going to see some pretty increased enforcement across the board. That's been on the agenda and very hyped up for some time. We've been hearing about these mass deportations that are planned. I think that in a lot of ways that's a kind of a legal impossibility. We're not going to see 1 million deportations a year. We're not going to see every single person who is here without status rounded up and sent out of the country. I mean, logistically, I think that's impossible. First off, if we just look at where our immigration system is right now, in the Denver area, the Colorado immigration courts for those deportation proceedings, I heard recently from one of the immigration judges that they have a 9,000 case backlog, and that's right now. So, a hearing might take 2-3 hours for somebody to get through, and if you're talking about a 9,000 case backlog, I mean, we're talking years and years and years out before somebody's even going to be scheduled for a hearing. So if you're now going to have this influx of cases where, I mean, we have due process, it's part of the Constitution. Everybody gets a chance to have their case heard because we do have immigration laws. It's on the books. We just can't, with the capacity that we have, handle the level of enforcement that's being talked about right now. I do think that we will see more workplace enforcement. So that could be worksite raids, that could be audits of various companies' immigration paperwork. When you generally are hired for a position, folks may know about the I-9 form. That's where you show the driver's license and social security card to show who you are and that you have work authorization. It doesn't have to be just those documents, but in general, it is you're showing who you are and that you have the ability to work in the United States. There's been a real decrease in the number of audits of those forms since COVID because there was just a huge backlog that developed during the COVID pandemic when these workplace raids couldn't happen. These worksite enforcements, they just couldn't happen for health reasons. I mean, they can't send agents in and look through your forms because we were all quarantined. So there's been a decrease, I'd say, in the last 4 years of those as they tried to work through that backlog, and I would expect that to increase again, where we're going to see companies going through these I-9 audit processes and other, I suppose, immigration paperwork and enforcement, measures. Certain immigration applications require you to maintain certain paperwork and to do things in a certain way, and I would expect additional site visits from certain fraud detection and national security officers who would verify that everything was done properly. And as a result of that, we may see some companies that have very significant fines that are levied against them. We may see some that are barred from using certain immigration programs, and we may see some very bad actors get caught. I mean, it's undeniable that there are bad actors out there. Even now, where there is this reduced enforcement level since COVID happened, we're still seeing some really just truly heinous stories come out from businesses and employers that take advantage of immigrants, especially undocumented immigrants who don't have or don't feel like they have the same level of protection that a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident may have. So I do think that we will see in large part just kind of a higher level enforcement across the board is how you could look at it. That's going to be just scrutiny on petitions. That's going to be kind of as a result of that a slowdown in the immigration process, which is already fairly lumbering, I guess is the best word for it. So we'll see a longer time for applications to be decided, and as a result of that, we'll probably see a higher denial rate and potentially lower application numbers as we have kind of a higher cost associated with making an application. If you're going to hire me to make an application and then we have a 50% chance of having an additional response that's going to be required, likely requiring some heavy legal argument involved in as well. Not just, hey, can you send me your birth certificate, but prove to me that you qualify for this benefit. We'll likely see an increased cost as a result of that, and that may mean that we have a reduced number of applications. But at the same time, if there is this increased enforcement and increased amount of removals from the United States for individuals, that may necessitate some people bringing in foreign labor because there just isn't the labor that was already here, albeit in an undocumented workers capacity. So we may see the need for individuals to bring over workers in potentially these temporary work visas, saying, I had folks on my workforce, I thought that they were lawfully able to work here. Turns out they weren't. Now I need to have new workers that I bring from Mexico, Guatemala, South Korea, South Africa, wherever it might be. I need to bring in additional workers because the workers I had are just not here anymore, or I've been told by these fraud detection and national security officers or Homeland Security investigation that they just are not authorized to work in the United States.
Let's talk about the backlogs, because I believe in our last conversation, we have the pleasure of talking about how much influx there is actually on how much people are applying in the US, to the point that we can't examine every single one of them because there's just this huge backlog. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's a backlog in affirmative applications when we make a petition for a visa. And then there's also a backlog in the immigration courts. And the immigration courts are what are going to be the real bottleneck for any sort of mass deportation measure. But in the spot that I deal with more often is the affirmative application process. And that's where there's absolutely massive backlogs. They have shrunk pretty significantly. They really ballooned during COVID, but they've shrunk significantly since then. But they are still massive, to the point that I do file a lot of lawsuits for cases taking way too long. If there's a certain type of application, it's for investors to invest over $1 million in the United States. As a result of that $1 million, they're going to create 10 U.S. jobs. There's a lot of requirements that go along with this. An absolutely massive amount of paperwork that go into these applications. The filing fee is over $10,000. So it's a huge application that's made. These applications are taking about 5 years to be decided. So you're investing $1 million into the United States. You're going to create 10 U.S. jobs, and you have no ability to be here and manage that business after you've made that investment. It's just in some ways, ridiculous, I guess, is the word I would put to it. Now, who's going to do an $1 million investment? And this is something that we want, right? We want somebody to create jobs in the United States and invest in businesses in the United States. And
I thought that before you invest at $1 million or that 10 jobs, you first must need to be approved to actually do that. So it's actually reversed. You need to first invest, then apply for it.
Correct.
You can maintain that.
It's an insane process. If it takes 5 years, there's alternative methods for this. There's ways to invest in kind of pooling your money and that takes about 1 to 2 years. It's called a regional center. It's where somebody invests in a project that's saying, I need to raise capital, and so let me apply to become this regional center where these investors can send their money, and that'll have a different queue that it's in. It's still 1 to 2 years and it's still $1 million. But if you were to invest in your own business that you're trying to create, that's a 5-year wait. And then after you've been approved, after 2 years, you have to apply to remove certain conditions on your permanent residency, which also takes about 5 years. So we're talking about a 12-year process to get to just your unrestricted normal green card, the type of green card that you would get if you were married to a U.S. citizen or something along those lines. So it's that's an extreme example, one of the ones that I think is most egregious. But across the board, there's huge delays. Things that should take minutes are taking months. We know, for example, work authorization documents, just the application for a card that says you're authorized to work. The Department of Homeland Security has put out the amount of time it takes for those to be adjudicated, for an officer to actually make a decision on it, and it's about 12 minutes. But we still see that at minimum, it takes about 3 months, and it can go much higher. It can go up to about a year. So for something that takes 12 minutes to decide, you might be waiting a year for it, and that's your direct ability to work. So while you don't have that, you don't have the ability to work in the United States. It's a truly across the board absurd system where we have massive waits for kind of basic things.
Correct me if I'm wrong. For every country, the people that are coming in from different countries, there's a set amount of immigration that could be approved per country, and the amount is the same for every country.
Yeah, that's for permanent residency, for green cards or immigrant visas. So the immigration system in the U.S. is divided between non-immigrant visas, and these are your temporary work visas, or like your student visas, things along those lines, and your immigrant visas, which are I'm coming to immigrate to the United States permanently. When people say do it the right way, they're often talking about having an immigrant visa and coming to the U.S. immigrant visa process. And yes, as you said, there is a set quota. 7% of these visas can be used per country per year. So countries that have a lot more people in them, like India and China, have very, very large backlogs where New Zealand has the same amount of visas allocated towards it and no backlogs, surprisingly. So if you're from India, for example, and you have an employer sponsoring you for permanent residency, your employer says you've been here working on this temporary work visa. We really love you and we want to keep you around. And they apply for you to get an employment-based third category, an EB3 visa. You might be waiting 30 years or more in line before you actually get that green card. And during that time, you have to either continue to work on these temporary work visas that have very strict restrictions attached to them. There's a lot of compliance required to work on these temporary work visas. You're kind of beholden to those for 30 years or maybe more while you're in this backlog, just watching the dates very, very slowly creep up towards when your application can be decided.
Because I was thinking, if I was a company in the US and I want to hire somebody, then I probably want someone who is living in a country where the backlog is not that long.
And in some ways, doesn't that create this incentive for discrimination? It's a little bit absurd. There's a category, the first preference category, an EB1. This is for people who have won Nobel Prizes, for example, are in this category. And there's a backlog there for people from India and people from China. So if you're a Nobel Prize winner, you are like the top of the world at what you do. We're saying, okay, but we still don't want you quite yet. Sure, you could come in about 3 or 4 years. It's a perverse system. The second category has something called a national interest waiver, where if you show that your work is in the national interest of the United States, that you can get this immigrant visa. And for people from India, that might be a 10 or 15 year wait. So you've already demonstrated when you're approved that your work is in the national interest of the United States. But even then we say, wait. Yeah, it's in the national interest, but not yet. We'll have to have you sit in line for a little bit longer before you let you work in this field and in this position that's going to be benefiting the national interest of the United States. So a lot of our laws, really, the reason that we have a lot of this kind of absurdity is because the last time our immigration laws were really substantively updated was 1990. And we had a little bit of a change in 1997. That's where a lot of new enforcement measures were created during the Clinton administration. And then we haven't had really much in the way of actual legislative change to our immigration laws since then. So 1990 is what we're working on. The executive branch through through regulations can change things, here and there, but they all have to comply with the statute that was created in 1990. And so we have these really, really outdated laws because the last time the laws were changed was before the internet was created. So it's a lot of absurd situations where you're trying to navigate how can this fit with how the world works in 2025 almost. Like, for example, work authorization in general, or the ability to work in the United States. When in 1986, when the laws surrounding work authorization and unauthorized employment were really created, that was during the Reagan administration. There was no such thing as remote work. There's no such thing as the internet. So there could not be this concept of I'm here in the United States on vacation and I'm just doing some work while I'm here. So we're having to navigate this system where, all right, well, maybe somebody's in the airport at JFK and they're answering emails, and technically, that violates immigration laws, but it in some ways is so small in that situation that I wouldn't expect any sort of negative consequences to attach to it. But you can see kind of this spectrum where, okay, sure, somebody's here without a work card and they're working at a company. Yeah, that's unauthorized employment. But what if you are here on vacation for 3 or 4 months, and in the meantime you're working remotely for your company that is in your home country? Should that be considered unauthorized employment? It's not taking a job from a U.S. citizen or a U.S. worker, but according to the laws created in 1986, it sure is. There could have been a U.S. worker who was working remotely for your company. So these are just some of the kind of absurdities that we have to deal with. And part of what makes immigration law a little bit fun, if you can get past the human impact of it, and why the litigation can be fun, because we're sometimes having to be pretty creative, because you say, well, the law created in 1986, it hasn't been updated since then, says this. And you have to say, well, yeah, but if you look at it in this way, and make all these creative and interesting arguments until you finally win the case for your client.
It's amazing. And, let's talk about the quotas. Let's bring the conversation back. Do you think it's going to be beneficial if we lower the number of quotas of people answering for the smaller countries and bigger for the bigger countries?
No, I don't think that changing the quotas around is really the solution in the end here. If we did that, so there's a kind of a real world example I can give of this. There's the fourth category, the EB4 category, did have a special kind of, provision for unaccompanied minors who were at the border. They would be in the employment-based fourth category. And those individuals would, really be from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So we had a huge backlog for those three countries. They had a smaller percentage of individuals who could come compared to the rest of the world. And the State Department in April of 2023 decided, you know what, I think that we're doing this wrong. We should not say that these individuals should be counted in the EB4 category solely for these countries. We should say across the world, we'll count them as if they counted everywhere. So the result of that was that the EB4 category now is so backlogged that every single other person who was in the EB4 queue, that's your religious workers, that's your translators from Iraq and Afghanistan who helped the U.S. Army, that's victims of domestic violence. Everybody in that category now is subject to a very massive backlog because the State Department said, we're going to get rid of this specific quota for Guatemala to Honduras and El Salvador in this one kind of criteria. So I think that the real solution is to either increase the number of employment-based visas that are available per year, or get rid of caps entirely and do that. If we get rid of caps entirely, it's going to kind of break the employment-based system, but it's kind of the only fair thing to do. It doesn't make any sense that one person has to wait 30 years for a green card and one person has to wait 2 years for a green card solely based on the fact that one was born, at this latitude and longitude, and this person was born at that latitude and longitude. So that's the fair thing to do. But then once that happens, the immigration system kind of breaks, because then nobody's able to get their green cards, and that'll necessitate in some ways increasing the numbers of visas, and I think maybe potentially getting rid of that cap on the number of visas altogether. So that's, I think, the real solution. If we were to try to just tweak numbers here and there, I think that the impact it's going to have is going to be negligible. I mean, we have a absolutely massive backlog for India and China. So if it was to be, Liechtenstein gets a few less visas and India gets a few more, in the end, yeah, it'll be helpful. It's not nothing, but it's not the solution to fix this kind of broken system.
It's a minor fix, but there's a much bigger change that needs to be happen.
Exactly.
And since one of your specialties is suing the U.S. government, can you talk about what really are some of the reasons that you've seen people sue the U.S. government? Just like you said, maybe the case that you're holding is taking too long, 5 years, 10 years overdue. Maybe you need to sue the government. What other stuff is the reason that you should sue the government?
I'd say there's three primary reasons that, in the immigration law space at least, that we sue the U.S. government. One is, and all of these are really based off of what's called the Administrative Procedure Act. It's this law that was created that kind of defines how agencies, executive agencies, have to operate. And there's really three things that we point to in this Administrative Procedure Act. One is that the government is required to make a decision in a reasonable period of time. So if the delay that a person's experiencing has become unreasonable, then we can file a lawsuit saying that this is an unreasonable delay. We need this decision to be made ASAP. Not necessarily approved or denied, just make a decision already, that type of thing. So that's one, is unreasonable delay. The second is through what's called arbitrary and capricious actions by the U.S. government. And that's really just saying that the government made a bad decision, they made a wrong decision, they didn't look at what you were submitting, that type of thing. They were arbitrary in their actions. They took your applications and in kind of an arbitrary way, they decided to not look at what you submitted and said, you're denied. And then you can sue them over that specific denial, saying this is an arbitrary and capricious decision by the government. And the third is the more far-reaching ones. This is based off of failure to comply with the Administrative Procedure Act completely. And this is where the agency maybe creates a policy or is just doing something that is contrary to the law entirely. In order to create a new regulation, to create a new policy, there's a specific procedure that needs to be followed. It's called notice and comment. They need to provide notice to the public that we're changing the law to include these few things. And then the public has to have the opportunity to comment on that. So one of my favorite examples of this is really earlier this year, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, they raised their fees on everything. And what they did is they had a notice of proposed rulemaking. They said, we're going to be raising our fees. Here's what we're going to be doing. We're not releasing the data, but if you do want to see the data, just call this number and we will set up a time so you can come in and review the data that we're using to change these fees. Well, that number was just some random guy who had no association with the U.S. government in any way. He wasn't associated with the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So anybody who wanted to actually review the data in a substantive way and say, let me see if this makes sense. Is this an actual raising of the fees that's logical, that's tied to inflation, that's tied to workforce time, anything like that? How many man hours this is going to be taking? Nobody could review that data because you call some guy and he's like, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. So in that way, then there's some lawsuits that are moving forward right now that are saying we didn't get the opportunity to actually comment on this because they just gave us a random number to call. They didn't even give us their own number to call. So there's things like that. During the previous Trump administration, a lot of what we were doing was, during the COVID period especially, the consulates kind of shut down. They said, we are not going to be issuing visas altogether because the president's issued a proclamation that says that it's going to be, I guess, against the national interest to admit certain people from certain countries that have high rates of COVID. But the law doesn't allow for that. The law allows for the restrictions on entry, but not the restrictions on visa issuance. Because what people could do is they could go to country X and then quarantine in country Y and then come to the United States, and it would be totally fine. But every consulate that was in country X, every embassy in country X said, well, because you can't enter the United States from our country, we're not going to give any visas. And so we sued about that. We said, you can't do that. The law doesn't allow that. This is a policy that was created that's not complying with the Administrative Procedure Act. And as a result, people were able to get their visas. A lot of folks were able to get united with their families. It was really a powerful thing. I thought one of the highlights of my career so far is, such a wide-reaching lawsuit saying, it's a tough time for everybody, but you can't keep families separated for years because of an incorrect interpretation of the law. So those are the three ways. It's an unreasonable delay, arbitrary and capricious action by the U.S. government, and then the third is that they didn't comply with the Administrative Procedure Act, and they and therefore were kind of acting outside of their legal authority.
I think one of the biggest questions on that is, if I'm just a normal guy, who am I to actually try and sue a government? Is there an actual chance that I can win against a government? Is there even a reason for me to actually do it? Why should I do it if I know, I might just lose? Is there a chance?
Absolutely. And I think there's that kind of initial reaction. And the other one is, what about retaliation against me? Those are the two things that people feel. I'm going to be suing the U.S. government. I'm going to be taking the U.S. government to court. Like, who am I to do that? But that's in the Constitution. That's something that you're legally allowed to do. And we have these laws that the government needs to comply with for a reason. So it can be intimidating, it can be scary. But if these people, like I said, they're very, very brave, and they take these cases on and they say, it's not right that I'm separated from my loved one because of this incorrect legal interpretation, or it's not right that I have been waiting in this line for 3 years to get my visa where other people are getting it in 4 months, or it's not right that my case was denied without them even looking at this evidence, where they can say it's not right and I'm going to stand up because of that. Absolutely. That's, what are, like I said, the government of checks and balances. We have the three branches of government. They're all supposed to check each other. And that third branch of government, the judicial branch, its whole point is that it can say, no, you can't do that. That was against the law. We have laws saying what you're allowed to do, and that's what you're not allowed to do. So if somebody's able to stand up, there's absolutely those chances to be successful, to have that win, whether that's, the judge goes all the way to the end and says, here is an unlawful thing, or we're just talking to the government attorney, and over the course of the lawsuit, they say, let's stop fighting this. We'll just give you your visa, or we'll offer to process this in, a month from the time that you dismiss the case. Those types of things, and that's kind of the settlement that we're looking at in a lawsuit on the immigration side of things. You're not really able to sue for money very often. There are very, very few instances where you can sue for money, but we're really suing for a result. And so we're trying to get that result, and oftentimes the government will come to an agreement with us when they realize that, hey, we're right, and they'll settle the case and say, here's what you were asking for, and maybe not exactly the time period that we wanted or anything like that, but here's what you're asking for, and we'll stop this case. We don't have to go in front of the judge anymore.
For any company out there who's interested in bringing in a global talent who might be intimidated on just how long the process could take, what advice would you give them?
So there's a couple of procedures that are already in the immigration system that you can use for a lot of, but not all, immigration programs. Sometimes if you are a bigger organization and you have the kind of financial capacity to do so, there's this thing called premium processing where you can pay an additional fee and the government will make a decision in a much shorter period of time. So that's one that oftentimes people utilize if they have a need to bring folks over in a much shorter period of time. I mean, the other one is that while it can be a little bit awkward to wait for, let's say a specialty worker, you're wanting to bring them in, although the earliest that we could really have them start would be next October. That's not ideal for a lot of companies, but knowing that you're getting kind of the person that you want, who has the skill set that you want, and really that you aren't able to find in the United States is, I think, it's kind of invaluable to say, yes, I have the perfect person, rather than settling for less because I couldn't find the U.S. worker, and the process was going to take too long. So I decided that I'd take somebody entry level instead of mid level, or something along those lines. The system's not perfect. There's not a visa for every situation. A lot of our system is built on protecting U.S. workers and making sure that U.S. workers have the opportunity to either apply for the position in advance of any non-U.S. worker getting the position, or it has built-in protections to make sure that wages are being paid at a certain level to not depress worker wages. So there's a lot of protections for U.S. workers built into the system, and a lot of companies see this as kind of maybe a backup in some ways, and in other ways they have the perfect person maybe sitting in their Hong Kong office ready to come over to their New York office, and they just need the right pathway to do. Kind of global mobility is, I think, becoming a bigger thing as companies are able to move talent around, as people are coming to the United States and going to school, and then after they graduate, trying to find positions at companies. It's becoming a much bigger thing. So especially with investors, and we have a lot of investors come to the United States and creating jobs themselves through their own companies. It's I think that, to your question on what would I say to a company that's a little bit intimidated by the process or by the length of time, it's just, let's explore what's available. Maybe there isn't something available. Maybe there's not something that fits all of your needs, but maybe there is. Maybe there's that perfect fit. Maybe you get that person of extraordinary ability that I was talking about, the person who's at the top of their field, and they're able to come and work for you because you took a chance and chatted with me or another immigration attorney to see if that is a viable option for you.
Do you think there's gonna be less applications submitted in the following years, especially for the employment-based visas, because we now have remote works?
I think that we may have fewer applications, but we also have a pretty tight labor market in various sectors. So, in the IT industry, that's maybe we won't see as many because we've been seeing a lot of very large layoffs. I know you know much more about AI than I do, but that's in some ways kind of lessening the need for software engineers, programmers, and things along those lines, in my experience. And so, where we have these large layoffs, the market for U.S. workers is much more available. But if you're looking at other types of industries, the market's very, very tight. And so where you don't have the ability to hire a U.S. worker, but you have the need to grow your business or your practice, you're more willing to step up and say, okay, let's give something a try. So I think it's possible that we will see a little bit more restricted access to the immigration system in the first few days of the Trump administration. I do think that it's possible that we see a higher rate of pushback from the immigration agency. But I do think that this underlying demand doesn't go away just because you say, immigration is, there's a need for workers, and where do you go for workers if they're not around?
On the topic that you said, that there's some industries that have, doesn't have a lot of workers in them, that needs to actually get imports, global workers that are good at what they do. On that point, I've spoken with a lot of people who uses manufacturing in other countries, or have built factories in maybe China or other countries with such a huge population. And the one thing that I ask is, why not just do it in the US? And they said, most people, they think it's about the prices, where we can pay lower wages, where we can, have lower costs in terms of production. But they said, the main reason is that there's an actual, pool of talent that we can pick from if we're working in these countries, and that options, just not in the US.
Absolutely. There's a specific type of visa called an H-2B, and that's one that I often will use for manufacturing jobs, construction jobs. I mean, you name these jobs that have more of a temporary need for not necessarily a lower skilled worker, but somebody who isn't super highly educated. Those visas are restricted to $66,000 per year. And that's split between the two halves of the federal fiscal year. So you have $33,000 for October 1st and onward, and you have $33,000 for April 1st and onward. I mean, I don't think I have to tell you that there's more than 33,000 jobs available in the summer for construction, for landscaping, for hospitality, for manufacturing. There's a visa there, but we just don't use it properly. We don't have this number that would fill everybody's needs. And that is one where there is an explicit recruitment period to see if there's a U.S. worker who would want the job first. And then in addition to that, that one requires a showing that there is this temporary need, not that it's a permanent need for you, but that you have a temporary need for these workers. We don't have a visa out there that's, I just need additional workers to come in and help me. There's nobody out there, and I need workers to come help me in my manufacturing plant, in my construction position, and whatever you might have. There is no visa that is, I need some help for a couple of years on this visa. There's just no such thing as this guest worker visa. It's one of the big holes in our immigration system. And like I said, there's not a fix for everything. We can talk about a lot of different ways that I can help an employer, but not everything. And so I think if you do want to bring manufacturing back into the United States in a real, any meaningful capacity, you have to have that workforce for it. And if we don't have the ability to, have that workforce here, which we don't, that's kind of just a fact. There's not the same level of folks who are doing those manufacturing jobs in the United States as there is a demand for them. And we need to be able to bring that home. And we don't have the ability to do that with our current immigration system. So one of the fixes that would need to happen in an upcoming comprehensive immigration reform, or even a limited immigration reform, is that guest worker visa, or an increase in the number of those H-2B temporary worker visas. It's limiting construction, it's limiting landscaping, it's limiting hospitality, it's limiting a lot of businesses to not be able to get the workers that they need to get.
For someone who is a U.S. resident or someone who is in the U.S. with a legal visa, when they are getting abused or, something bad happens to them, they can come ask for help. What about the ones that came into the country illegally? Can they actually get help? And how could they do that?
Yeah, the laws apply equally to whether somebody is here in a documented status or in an undocumented status. The problem is that the folks who are undocumented are largely considered to be in a much more vulnerable position, and often are in a much more vulnerable position. One, because they can't access a lot of the social benefits that are available to everybody. So, things like welfare, things like Medicaid, things like the marketplace for healthcare. None of those are accessible to folks. So, they have that limitation. But then the second part is that they just have this feeling that there's less access to the various law enforcement, things along those lines. But we do actually have programs and visas that have been created to help those individuals and to try to encourage reporting of cases of violent crimes, things along those lines. There's a visa called a U visa, where if somebody has been a victim of certain types of crimes, they can report it. If they assist law enforcement in the investigation and the prosecution of that crime, they can be given this visa, which then can become permanent residency as kind of a not necessarily a reward, but an incentive to come forward and to try to reduce the crime levels against especially against vulnerable groups. For labor abuses, if you're at an employer and that employer is an extremely abusive employer, discrimination, wage theft, all these kinds of employment-based crimes that are maybe a little bit less, sexy, they are also programs there that the Department of Labor has worked with the Department of Homeland Security with to say, hey, if we're investigating, a large-scale discrimination or wage theft claim against an employer, and our witnesses are undocumented, well, we should give them some sort of temporary status, some temporary ability to be in the United States, temporary ability to work lawfully. It's called deferred action. And so, folks don't necessarily know. It's again, a group that it feels like they don't have a lot of power. And so if they are having their wages stolen from them, they're being abused, things like that, they don't necessarily report it at the same levels that a U.S. resident or a U.S. citizen might do. But if they do, there is this incentive because, hey, if you help us, you are allowed to get this deferred action, this work authorization, this ability to be in the United States as this investigation's going. So there are programs available. They just maybe aren't as publicized as they could be. And in some ways, they're targets for the upcoming Trump administration to get rid of, because as the Project 2025, which I know is not the actual playbook of the administration, they said so many times, but in that playbook, I suppose that they have said that these U visas, T visas for victims of human trafficking, they should be done away with, because they're being a victim, it shouldn't be a basis for getting status in the United States. So that's one that I don't actually think is going to be it's going to happen, because that would require a legislative change, and it's, I think, an incredibly unpopular legislative change, but something, I suppose, as we're chatting about potential changes for the upcoming administration, it's on their list.
That's amazing. And since we're nearing the end of the podcast, what advice would you give to anyone who's who wants to apply for a U.S. visa but is scared about the process?
Yeah, I'd say that, there's a lot of immigration attorneys out there who would be happy to talk you through your options, the process, any fears that you might have. It is intimidating. I mean, relocating across the world is intimidating. There's no two ways about that. It's a process where you're dealing with the U.S. federal government, and that can be absolutely just a mind-boggling process that takes years, and there's arbitrary decisions along the way. And so it's good to have somebody in your corner. So I suppose my first piece of advice is, if you have an opportunity, why not take it? It could really be a life-changing thing. It's not like you're going to be stuck in the United States forever. If you don't like it, you can certainly leave. But if there's an opportunity for you and you want to take it, then I'd say take advantage of the immigration lawyers who would love to chat with you, who are really passionate about this and want to help you succeed. If you want to open a business in the United States, let's chat and let's see what can you do to get that visa. If your company wants to transfer you to the United States and you're a little bit intimidated about what that process looks like, let's talk it through. It's this lack of knowledge, I think, is where a lot of the anxiety comes from, because it is a big move, a big change. But once you understand what you're going to be going through, it's a much more manageable and hopefully an exciting thing that somebody's going to be dealing with.
And there are some people who are not financially well off to actually afford a legal representation when they want to apply for a visa in the U.S. What resources or what books or maybe other sources do you think they should explore to actually learn?
So the first point I'd make is that some visa types, and some of the more common ones, the employer is legally required to pay for all costs and fees associated with them. So for a lot of visa applications, you're free and clear. You don't have to pay for anything. The second thing, to understand the process a little bit more, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is actually very, very good about publishing its policies and how it looks at various application types. So there's this U.S. CIS policy manual that you could look up to see what the application process looks like, what they're looking to see. And then at the consulates, at the embassies, there's this policy manual called the Foreign Affairs Manual, and that really goes into what the consulates are looking at when you go in for an embassy interview or a consular interview for a certain visa application type. Now, I do think that at least starting off with a consultation with an immigration attorney is very helpful. Immigration law, like I said, is created in 1990. It was the last time we really updated it. So there's a lot of things that don't make sense, and that means that there's a lot of pitfalls along the way. Things that you wouldn't expect to be an issue that could be an issue. And so identifying those early is a really, really important task.
That's amazing. And do you have any advice on life?
On life?
Yeah.
I'd say, take risks. It's we only are living one time, so if you're passionate about something, if you're excited about something, and an opportunity is presented to you, take advantage of that opportunity. You're not going to be stuck with something forever, but sometimes things only come up once.
Yeah.
Now, we talked very briefly about my pathway to where I am right now as an attorney, but my pathway to partnership was really a series of fortunate accidents where I took advantage of opportunities and said, absolutely, let me jump into this, where that was scary and it was could have really, but it worked out well for me in the end, and as a result, I'm doing things that I love. Beyond just immigration, I think that really in life, just take risks, take advantage of opportunities that come your way, and move towards where you want to be in life as a result.
That's amazing. And thank you for joining us on the New World Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's all for today's episode of the New World Podcast. We have explored some fascinating topics with our amazing guests, shedding light on the upcoming New World. If you enjoyed today's episode and today's discussion and want to stay updated on the future episodes, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to the podcast. And if you found value on what we have discussed, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast platform. Remember, if you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover, or if you are interested in being a guest in the future, please feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn or email me at john.paul@aicinix.com and add New World Podcast, all capital, in the subject line so I can see it. I always love hearing from our listeners. And don't forget to check out our amazing guests. You can find more information about them by the contact details we provided earlier. Again, thank you for tuning in on the New World Podcast. I know your time is very important, and I try to always make the next episode better than the last. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, keep innovating. This is John Paul Flores signing off from the New World Podcast.